Ready? Cheers. Good evening. I'm Linda Johnson, and I'm President and CEO of Brooklyn Public Library, and I can think of few sentences that would make me happier than the one that says, please join me in welcoming Moshe Safdie and Michael Kimmelman to the stage here in the Dweck Auditorium. I've now been at the library for 11 years, which is really hard to believe, and I've learned a lot about the distribution of books and the importance of internet access and providing free Wi-Fi to our patrons, the importance that libraries play in communities in terms of connecting people and creating town square-like environments where people can come together and talk about the dilemmas of the day or the things that are on their mind. But it might surprise you that one of the things I've learned most about since I've been here in Brooklyn is how important it is to build inspiring and socially responsible spaces that are free and accessible to all. Not only buildings that are watertight, that are warm in the winter, that are cool in the summer, but spaces that make people sit up a little taller and do their best work. And I can think of no better speakers than Moshe and Michael to address some of these issues. Moshe is an architect, urban planner, educator, theorist, and author. And he's had an extraordinary career that got off to a very auspicious early start with the building of Habitat 67 in Montreal. And he's gone on to build some of the most extraordinary spaces that you could imagine, really some of them beyond most people's imagination, including Crystal Bridges in Arkansas, Yad Vashem in Israel, the Tel Aviv airport, the airport in Singapore, and there's a long, long list, but each one a little different and a little more innovative and creative than the last. And it never ceases to amaze me that now, after 60 years of being at it, he still has the same crazy travel schedule. He's just in from Dubai, and I'm not exaggerating. I'm prone to exaggerate, but this is for real. And he's recently written a new book that's called If These Walls Could Speak, and sets forth his vision for the role of architecture and the role that architecture should play in society at large. Joined with us tonight is Michael Kimmelman, the architecture critic of the New York Times. Michael has covered cultural and political affairs across the globe. Twice was a Pulitzer Prize finalist. Previously the Times chief art critic. He created the Abroad column. He's now the founder and editor-at-large of a new Times venture focused on global challenges and progress called Headway. He's also one of the smartest people in that building over there, that beautiful New York Times building. He's also a musician, a pianist, and we're thrilled that Michael could be with us this evening. Thank you both for making time with us.
So can you guys hear me? Is this on? Moshe, it's 7:10. We have about 6 hours of things to talk about. We're going to try to do that in some reasonable amount of time. I want to say to people out here that your book is really wonderful. It's really, it's a lovely, a beautifully written, intimate, modest, and very clear memoir.
Thank you.
Yeah, and
Coming from you, wow.
I think people will get a lot from it, whether they're architects or not. And it raises so many different interesting issues. We're just going to sort of roam around a little bit. So we put together a whole bunch of slides. If this is incredibly disorganized, you have to blame me, because I just wanted to have a lot of things to talk about. So let's start at the beginning and see how far we get. Um, this is you at the age of what? 15?
14.
14. You just mentioned a minute ago that you went back to this spot yesterday or something.
3 days ago, I was in that spot, and Michal took my picture on the railing in the same pose, because she'd seen the picture.
So where are you?
I'm on our terrace in Haifa. We had moved up the mountain. It was on the third floor of an apartment on the hillside, and so that each apartment had direct access from the hill, like bridges, and we also had the roof terrace, so this was my view.
Right. So you grew up in the city of Haifa. You talked a lot about in the beginning. Just give us a very quick description of your family and what Haifa was like at that point.
Well, yeah, my family, my father came there before the World War from Aleppo, from Syria. I often wondered what motivated him. Was he a Zionist, or did he just want to get out of Syria? He was a merchant. My mother came to visit from Manchester.
She was English.
She was English, except her parents came from Aleppo also. She was coming to visit her sister in Jerusalem. She went to a coffee house when she came off the ship before taking the bus to Jerusalem, and she never went back to England. They were engaged in a week and married in a month, and I came out 9 months and 5 days later. But Haifa was extraordinary. It was then the headquarters of the British Mandate. It was the only port in Palestine. I thought of it as a very beautiful city on the hill. I've just been there this week, and the pine trees are just amazing. The Baha'i Gardens, which I lived next to, most beautiful Persian gardens, and then this modernist thrust of modern construction. So I grew up in a sort of a catalog of Bauhaus architecture. And the state in the making, I was 10 when the state was declared. I remember the fighting in the War of Independence vividly. I mean, you know, there were bullets coming through the windows, and I remember going down town and seeing people looting. I mean, there were, you know, one of the things that amazes me is that we were 10 years old. We roamed all over the city, me and my friends. No adults. Nobody was overlooking or supervising us. We took mass transit. You know, at 10 years, we were fully independent.
You speak a lot in the book and about the way in which the nature of Haifa. Well, so Haifa was a much more open city than other parts of.
Yeah, Haifa has a major Arab population. It is said that, unlike some other places, the loudspeakers during the fighting begged them to stay. Many did stay. It's probably the most harmoniously cohabited city in Israel.
But there was also something about the layout of the city, the relationship of the buildings to nature, the way they climbed up the hills.
Well, topography always creates very particular architecture. But what was interesting about Haifa is that the lower levels were sort of the vernacular, the Arab market, and then there were a number of villages on the mountain itself, like in the vernacular. And then it turns color from yellow to white, and it's all Bauhaus-like white, like Tel Aviv white, Haifa white. And then as it goes up onto the top of the hill, everything sort of gets molded into the pine trees, and it's like a garden city, becomes a garden city.
We have here also, well, so we're going through some of this, and then you come to the gardens.
These are the Bauhaus-like buildings, and Kingsway, which is now Independence Boulevard, and then the Baha'i Gardens. To me, as a kid, this was like paradise. There were gold bronze peacocks, and there were flowers galore, and pine trees, and and cypresses and little tempietos like that. It's the holiest place for the Baha'i religion, and you know, it was like our backyard.
Yeah, I mean, you talk in the book about how that notion that living with some views onto nature and having some connection was crucial to. It was just what you assumed a house was, and that this was obviously, you know, going to be part of your thinking when you got to Habitat.
I certainly think that like the notion that you have a house and it's open and have a garden and a view and I mean, we also had like mini farming around us and all that, really became my idealized place to live in. And as I came to cold and snowy Montreal, that kind of lingered.
Yeah. Why did you leave? I mean,
My parents left, and I had to follow. I mean, we felt being forcefully exiled was as traumatic as the Roman exile, I think. We did go to Rome first, which was kind of, I think, an attempt to appease us. Rome, Milan, Paris, London. So, and that was an exposure to. That was my first airplane trip at age 15,
you talk about that in the book.
I think my daughters here have been around the world 6 times by that age. It was like opening up the world. I mean, I remember even the cuisine like shocking me.
Before we move you out, though, you had not thought of becoming an architect, but when in the book you describe sort of looking back and seeing the foundations of your making as an architect in what you were experiencing as a boy in Israel. But at the time you thought you were working on a kibbutz.
We're going to build a kibbutz, the whole group of us, youth movement. I was registered in the Kaduri Agriculture School to go to, and you know, I would have gone with my friends and become working the land.
Right.
So I was very upset about leaving, but arriving in Canada, there was no social life, right? So for me, at least. So I started reading and studying and discovering.
Which you hadn't been doing a lot of before.
No, I was. My report in the Reali School, which is supposed to be one of the best schools in Israel, was year after year, Moshe does not control his spirits.
So you arrive in Montreal and you suddenly find yourself in a cold climate. And by the way, a very different climate of different Jews.
Yeah, I went to Westmont High, which later on I found out Kamala Harris went to for a couple of years. And more familiar to me because he was my neighbor was Leonard Cohen, who had gone there. Yeah. But first I get interested, and I had a wonderful English teacher. And we did the book of Job.
How was your English when you arrived?
My mother's English, so I spoke it, but it was bad enough that they sent me to a special prep school to brush up. And I still can't spell, but that's another matter. But I get interested in language. I mean, we do the book of Job, King James. And after years of studying Bible in Israel and being bored, I discovered the Bible. And we do Julius Caesar, and, with a good teacher, just the magic of it, and a wonderful science teacher. So I've become interested.
Right. And what attracted you to architecture? Why did you end up doing? You went to McGill.
So
you started a 6-year program, right?
So at the final year at Westmont, we got an aptitude test, and so you fill all the things, and it says there's a graph, and it says very good in art and good in math, suitable for architecture. And I knew I didn't want to be a merchant as my father was in business. And I was expected to, as the eldest Sephardic son, expected to join the father's business. So there were emissaries and people saying you have to. So I made a deal. I worked every summer while I was studying architecture in my father's business, so I'd know the business in case. And so I can still tell you this is 120 count, whatever. But my father, once I started doing well in school, he kind of
He was okay.
is okay.
I will interject just that my father was an old lefty, and he was convinced that the New York Times was run by the CIA. And so he would circle and,
Things have changed.
well, anyway, he would circle and underline things and cut them out. I thought the New York Times must be very important. And then in his declining years, when he was sort of losing his morals a bit, I ended up in the New York Times. I was quite young. And I remember him saying, yeah, you know, the Times is getting a lot better lately, which was, I think your father probably came around to you doing architecture because, and we're beginning to look at what you did earlier on. So you go to McGill, you study architecture. Before we get to the design for Habitat and your prodigious things, talk a little bit about that education. There may be some architects out here. And in the book you speak interestingly about, you know, you went at an interesting moment, and McGill's focus was not on turning you into, it was very practical and focused on building. And maybe you could just talk about that a little bit.
The nice thing about McGill was the School of Architecture was a department in part of the School of Engineering. And so the emphasis is, first of all, on a lot of engineering, which really is a wonderful foundation, structural engineering, other form of engineering. And in the school, a great emphasis on building, like we design a house and the next thing we're building a corner of the house one-to-one with real materials. And so you had the sense that that architecture is the art of building, not of theorizing. I mean, later on I went to Harvard to teach, and you know, all the fancy theories and all that, none of that stuff. And actually it had an impact on me, because I really, in the sense of, I can't stand when people talk about architecture in funny language. I walk into reviews in the school, and you know, I think I know the profession, and I don't understand what they're saying, and I sit there and I don't understand what they're saying.
Yeah.
And so this sort of simple, plain language about the profession, which actually leads to straight thinking, I think. But it's all about building, and it's with a strong emphasis on the social mission of the profession.
Right. I mean, if I may say, it was also not about the objecthood of these things. It wasn't about says that they were sculptures, but it was about the practical aspects of them.
Yes.
Which,
But also, in terms of the fashion of the day, Mies van der Rohe was God. Le Corbusier was sort of strange European, and Mies van der Rohe was God.
yeah.
Both were European, of course, but
Right, but you describe this interesting thing that happens to you, which is that you begin to think about, you start by designing, what was the building in
Knesset. I want to do the Knesset for my thesis.
Knesset, right.
The
Lots of
Israeli parliament.
Right.
Uh,
But then you begin to evolve and start to think in terms of systems, which is really interesting.
Well, there's a moment where I get a traveling fellowship, one student from each Canadian School of Architecture to study housing, a government-sponsored program. And so we travel the United States, and we go to public housing projects and lots of Levittowns and some garden cities, things like Chatham Village in Pittsburgh and so on. But what really hits me is those public housing high-rise in New York and Philadelphia and Chicago. And I come back saying, like, we got to rethink this. We got to reinvent the apartment building. The people go to the suburbs because they want their house and their garden. But if we can reinvent it so it has the quality of life on an apartment, everybody will stay in the city and will live happily ever after.
Yeah, I mean, this was the time people were abandoning cities, but also this goes back to your childhood, right? You had seen how people lived in a city happily, what people liked about city life.
And that you could, at least in the densities of Haifa, you could do it in a quite a livable way. So now I was saying, if we could do high rise and capture that quality of life. And so Habitat, in a sense, is trying to do that. And so I get onto the idea of prefabrication. So let's prefabricate whole part of the unit, boxes. Let's arrange them in whatever arrangements, and then Habitat. Well, my thesis comes out of that.
So this is from your thesis.
That's one of the sketches of the thesis where I'm placing them in a frame, in a structural frame, and they're arranged in a way that each one has its own garden.
So you were how old at this point? 20?
I was very young because I got into university at 17. So at this point, I'm 22. The thesis 22.
Okay, so you're 22 years old, and you've come up with this sort of revolutionary idea for housing. And you obviously thought that you were onto something.
Yeah.
But not everyone recognized this immediately.
No, because people don't do building systems for the thesis. They used to do opera houses and libraries, Knessets. But a man called Van Ginkel comes from Holland to teach. He was partner of Aldo van Eyck, very well-known.
You have him in here? No,
We
don't.
I don't think so.
Okay, sorry.
That's the model of my thesis, enormous model. Like we worked long hours, and so there is, somehow I get tied into the European school, the group called Team 10,
Right.
and they publish this in Holland, and the word gets around. So then. I decide, during the trip, we visited the Richards building of Louis Kahn, which blew my mind. I thought that was really radical, thinking about building as multiple systems, structure, mechanical systems, each have their place. He used to call them served and servant spaces. And I decided I want to work for him, and I managed to get an interview.
Kahn was at that point just emerging, really.
Emerging, but he was already a cult figure.
Right.
And I managed to get an interview, and I spread my thesis. These days, young architects come with portfolios. We didn't have portfolios then. Just drawings and spread them on the table. And he hired me right there and then, and I spent a year and something there. Amazing experience.
Yeah, what did you get from him? I mean, I know we only have a few minutes.
So I'd say more than anything else, apart from his sensitivity to light, his sort of bridging the archaic and the contemporary, was how to run a practice. I think my office is sort of in the image of his practice. It's bigger and things are more complex. But the idea that buildings are conceived, begin with conception with a charcoal, with a pencil, and then you detail them, and then you build mock-ups, and then you construct them, and then you oversee the construction. And each phase you're making decisions, and each part informs the end product. That's what I learned from him, that it's not you conceive something and then it gets built, It's a process with all those phases, and I think that's essential to making good buildings.
Yeah. Well, you were there a year, I think, something like this, and then you were called back to Canada to do Habitat.
No, I'm called to head the team doing the master plan
For the Expo 60.
for the expo by my professor Van Ginkel,
Right.
who is in charge of putting the team together and so on. And with my, I don't know, I guess it was quite a bit of chutzpah, I said, I will come back if I'm also allowed to develop my thesis as a possible pavilion for the World's Fair. And he says, okay, you can do it in your own time. And so we do the master plan, which turns out to be was one of the most successful fairs in recent history. And I get...
Has there been a fair like it? I can't...
No, I think that was the last great
Yeah.
fair. Osaka tried to after. And
So stop for a second and just... why was that fair? What was it about that moment and that fair?
I think about that moment, there was even an attempt not to have national pavilions. It turned out all the countries insisted on pavilion, but there were theme pavilions. The commercial pavilions were very minor or non-existent. Later on, when I went to, for example, Shanghai Fair or Milan recently, I'd say over 50 are corporate exhibits, so completely different. This was like humanity at its best and optimistic. I mean, this was Canada's centennial before separatism erupted. It was like a moment of great national pride. The very fact that I got to present the idea when it was approved by the Expo management to the Cabinet of Canada, Lester B. Pearson, the Prime Minister, sitting at the end of the table, and I'm 24 years old putting the models out. I mean, you know, think about it. It doesn't.
It was I mean, I think of that as one of those events in the 60s. And frankly, there was a World's Fair here in 64,
Yeah.
which was also sort of very much optimistic, future related. It was possibly more commercial, but there was a different kind of ethos about architecture. This was, of course, the place where Bucky Fuller's geodesic dome happened as well. It's hard to...
And Fry Otto's tent for the German
tent.
pavilion, yeah.
Yeah. So it was very much a kind of, that's interesting you say optimistic. It was a forward-looking event.
The world was going to be better,
Yeah.
and
that was the spirit of Habitat.
yeah.
So get to that a little bit. You had to actually, they didn't entirely, it wasn't clear sailing, right? So there was
No, I mean, first I'd managed to get some funding because at some point beyond night work, one needed engineers and a team, and the cement companies had somebody running around there offering a $50,000 grant to promote cement. I did not know that I would use concrete necessarily, but grabbed the funds, and I went to Philadelphia and I brought August Commandant.
they have like a slogan like cement, it's hard not to love it or something like this, or nothing?
Not that I recall.
Sorry.
And we brought Commandant, who was one of the great concrete engineers, but
You had worked with Kahn.
who did most of Kahn's building.
Yeah.
And he came over, and there were models already, and at this point it became like more inclined, pyramidal, and you know, he was a pipe smoker, and he had a very strong German accent. He was Estonian actually, but had studied in Dresden, and he sucks on his pipe for probably half an hour, and then he says, "It can be done." And that was like the get going,
Impetus, right.
you know, impetus, and we developed the plans in detail until we got to. But then when we got to the government, they looked at this model, 1,200 units covered the whole peninsula, and they said, we had a formula, a tax concession. Zeckendorf would build it, the great New York developer.
Yeah.
And they said, no tax concession, it's too much of a precedent. That was $42 million for the whole thing. We can't do it now. Time.
Just to
Take
stop for 1 second
yeah.
again, how many units of housing?
1,200 was the original. What we
1,200
built
for
was
42.
159.
Right. 1,200 units of housing for $42 million. The budget came down, of course.
They said,
Yes.
take $15 million, do what you can. And I said, what? You know, it's everything or nothing. But I sobered up very fast.
You didn't say no.
And the factory was $5 million, so we ended up with 159.
You had a competing proposal, which I think is here in this photograph, for a tower. So what? Just before we move.
Well, the mayor from day one, he had the idea to create the islands in the St. Lawrence, but from day one, he wanted a tower. And the committee that established the theme for the pavilion, for the expo, said, Terre des Hommes, man in his world, no vertical tower is a symbol. So this became the battle between Habitat and the tower, and
You won.
we won. It wasn't easy.
Thank goodness. We could spend the whole time talking about habitat, and there's a lot here about it. Let us just say, obviously, it
It
raises
is.
a lot of different issues. One is you were so young, and you had done something so big, and clearly everyone recognized it as a really important and game-changing thing. Here you are on the cover of Newsweek. I mean, let me ask you again. There are architects out here. Looks exactly the same to me. You know, what was that like? Also, because it's a leading question because here you were phenomenally successful. You were now incredibly famous. You've done something very important that set a high bar, but it wasn't that every door opened for you and you were suddenly building a million things. You had a lot of
Yeah, well,
rejections.
the first reaction is you're on top of the world. And, 50 million people show up at Expo, and I'm living right in the building. It was like a good party. My two older children, older children, they were very young at the time, living in the building, so it's like a real high, but the commissions start coming, and they come like big time. Lindsay and Carol Hausman in New York for Habitat New York, and Washington, Puerto Rico, Tehran.
These are some of those projects.
These are some of them, and
How many of them got built?
none. One after the other, and we get into details. And Puerto Rico even had the factory built and some units fabricated. It was all under HUD's Operation Breakthrough, and then Nixon dismisses Romney, the father of Romney, who was Secretary of HUD,
George Romney, yeah.
who had initiated the program, and it stops. So a lot of sort of disappointments.
Yeah, I mean, just let's linger over that for a moment. I mean, you had this incredible run, getting Habitat done, designing that, working with Khan. All of this is incredible, and then suddenly you confront the realities of being an actual architect.
In the real world,
Real
and no
world.
World's Fair. And on top of it all, year after year, not a single job in Canada. Because I start getting other work, not Habitats, but I go back to Jerusalem after 19 years of absence. I'm embraced. I start working on both projects in Jerusalem and in Israel, but nothing in Canada. So that also was kind of a slap in the face.
Let's get to that in a moment. I want to just go through a couple of these projects. What is this one, by the way, we're looking
This one is in Canada, and much of it happened after I left for Boston. But this is housing for the Inuits in what was then Frobisher Bay. It now has an Inuit name. And the government of what was called then of the Northwest Territories commissioned to design a prefabricated house that can be in tundra, in tundra land. They were then, the Inuits were settling into permanent, from nomadic life, and into what was called matchboxes. And matchboxes describes exactly what they were. And they were just plunked on the ice, and these were really very depressing. So this was an attempt to sort of capture their lifestyle and so on. And
And
like
you spoke to, I mean, before you came up with this, you spoke to them.
I spent a lot of time in the north
Right.
at the time. And then the government says that raises too much expectations. Bingo.
So they canceled.
Canceled.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, so Habitat at that early stage was considered revolutionary, and then nobody actually wanted to do it. Because now, of course, it again seems like such a
Yeah, it was.
timely thing. It's for prefab.
And the
everything.
critics had their heyday. I mean, Ada Louise Huxtable was kind, but others were saying this is a one-time thing. One-timer.
Yeah. So you went back to Israel. And let's skip through for a second. Shall we? And go back to Israel.
Sure. There we go.
So you go back, but in a very different. Now you've designed.
I'm
That you're world famous.
local boy done well. Yeah.
Local boy done well. And what is the Israel you've returned to now?
It's very different. A million refugees absorbed, ugly housing projects all over the place, but Jerusalem and Haifa and so on still quite
Those refugees
amazing.
came from parts of the world that had not.
Mostly Middle East.
Right. So a different Jewish population.
Very a different mix.
Right.
Of course, I'm Sephardic, so I'm part of them, but I grew up in a school where, you know, I sound totally Ashkenazi to an Israeli, so there is a kind of a surge of population, mostly Morocco actually,
Yeah.
that has arrived. So the country is absorbing them, and
It was kind of unrecognizable to you, you said in the book. Parts of it were. Right?
yeah, parts of it were, and parts of it were totally familiar, but parts of it, and it seemed provincial.
Huh, interesting. But it was also a place that was coming, Teddy Kollek had become mayor, right, in Jerusalem.
And he became mayor before the Six-Day War, but then he found himself the mayor of a united city. And he embraces me and commissions me to do some work in Jerusalem. There's a minister of housing from the Mapam party. That's the party that was wiped out last week, the Socialist Labor Party, who commissions me to do yet another habitat that didn't get built, but also other stuff. And
Like what?
like helping to master plan some of the housing areas. And the condition is that I set up an office there.
Right.
And so I set up an office in Jerusalem, a branch office, because my main office is still Montreal. And I start commuting like a week a month.
Yeah. Let's pause for a second and just, you and I saw each other before COVID in Jerusalem because you had sort of alerted me to this insane plan that now seems to be maybe revived again, to put cable cars over the old city. I don't want to dwell on that, but you had an election again, and you have. I mean, for a moment, just talk. You go back to Israel in '67. You're there, part of rebuilding.
The country is in euphoria.
Yeah.
Total euphoria. The city is united. None of the issues we have become aware, and certainly not the whole idea of occupation at this scale and timeline was something one was aware of. And so there's a lot of rebuilding and excitement, and the Jewish Quarter, which was in ruins, is totally rebuilt, which I get involved in, and the areas of the no man's land and so on. But the country also, since then, starts changing because of the consequences of the occupation. And so and all that starts. On one hand, the country gets much more sophisticated, very prosperous. I call it the state of Tel Aviv. It's progressive, liberal, and the rest of the country is becoming more and more nationalized.
But you described Teddy Kollek to me once as sort of he had a global ideal for Jerusalem, and that obviously this was what your project was too in the early days. What was?
I felt complete identity and sync with Kollek. He sees it as a city of three religions and a cosmopolitan city. That does not diminish his passion that it's the capital of Israel, but he sees it for what it is, which is an international, multi-population, multi-religious city. And he promotes the Armenians and the Christian and the Muslim quarters and so on, and try to create infrastructure at that moment in time. He was the last great mayor. After that, it was downhill. And
Yeah, that must be. I mean, it must be such an incredible arc. You were involved with the reconstruction of how we would describe it, the old city, right?
The Jewish Quarter and the Mamilla area outside the walls, and I
Which
also
had been the no man's land you referred
correct,
to. Right?
correct. And I also did a plan, which we see here, for the area in front of the wall, the western wall, which is a big mess. It was a neighborhood that was demolished right after the Six-Day War in order to open it up so that it could have gatherings of hundreds of thousands. But it stays that way, like an accidental space. And so this plan went through all kinds of hearings and approvals, got approved, then another Begin shows up and gets elected. And when Begin gets elected, the religious gets very strong. And by then I did the Hebrew Union College for the Reform movement, so that's one strike against me. And then, you know, my political views, that's another strike. And so the religious basically groups have opposed that, blocked that plan since then.
Well, for the wall, though, when you arrived back in '67, what did it look like? Was it even visible, or was it just in a?
When I arrived in '67, it had already been cleared in front of it. I remember it as a child, where you go down the stairs and all of a sudden it reveals itself. And if the wall is there, the next neighborhood is like twice the distance of the stage. I mean, it's just like
Right.
a tiny space. Yeah. But that changed when actually Teddy Kollek decided to demolish that.
Yeah. Which was controversial and remains so.
Yes, but in retrospect, you could have not had gathered hundreds of thousands of people as they do. So.
Right. You felt, I mean, going back to Israel, because you describe in the book also as a child sort of still feeling like you were going to go back in the beginning when you moved to Montreal. So in what sense did you feel like returning to Israel was closing that circle, like you belonged there?
It's interesting because for 19 years I'm, you know, craving to go there. But by then I have a family, I have an office, I have an international practice. And so when I get there, I realize that I feel at home and very exciting, and the work is exciting. But I also realize I'm not going to be there full time. And I never have been there full time because I feel if I did that, I would be giving up my international involvement.
You thought about running for mayor.
At some point when Teddy was stepping down and the candidates were not very appealing, and I thought what good I could do to the city for two reasons. One is being an architect, so sensitive to its heritage and its visual side, but also I felt that being Sephardic, speaking a little bit of Arabic, I could bring the people of the city together. I was, I think, very naive, but probably could have done something positive. But I also realized at some point that's giving up architecture. There's no way you can do both, and then I felt I can't.
You're glad you didn't.
I'm glad I didn't because being mayor in Jerusalem is so subject to extraordinary forces you have no control over at all.
Yeah. As I feared and predicted, we've made it barely into your 30s, I suppose. So let's zip through a little bit because there's a lot to talk about. Maybe we can talk, this is Mamilla, of course, which you designed in that no man's land.
It took 40 years from the moment I master planned that area, starting in '72, which is developing the area outside Jaffa Gate that is between the new city and the old city, between the Arab city and the Israeli city, the Jewish part of the city. And the reason, as a mixed-use complex, the reason I'm adamant is because I believe that's the one place where everybody will get together, like in the marketplaces of the old city in the old days. And every opposition, first it's the Greens who say you can't build a contemporary development near the old city that's sympathetic. Then it's archaeology. Then we find a cave with 600 skulls in it and bones, and it has a nice Greek cross over it, and the archaeologists say this is from the Persian massacre of 600 A.D. But the rabbinate starts, because you can't move Jewish graves, the rabbinate says maybe there was a Jew amongst them. So they try and block the construction. Eventually, 2 o'clock in the morning, Teddy sends all the bones are removed and reburied in the Greek Orthodox cemetery. So, and then the religious wake up and say, no commercial near the old city, no movie houses and all that. So it literally 30 years of struggle, and then now it is the pulse of the city, now that it's open.
I mean, there is something kind of, maybe beautiful is not the right word, but something about that process that is, beautiful is probably completely the wrong word. I'm a little, but you know,
Painful beauty.
yeah, something like this. But well, let's keep going a bit, because you also designed their Yad Vashem, the museum,
Holocaust Museum, yeah.
the Holocaust Museum. Describe that a little bit. I think it's going to just set up some of the late projects, and then we can open this up for questions too. The evolution of this was interesting. You're thinking about how the design.
First, I did the Children's Memorial, which was done in the 70s, and they wanted a museum. And after seeing all the objects and all that, I felt people would be saturated with information after the Historic Museum, and I proposed a place of contemplation, the one candle that reflects into infinity. And this was rejected. They said people think it's a discotheque, and you know, it was before Maya Lin's memorial as well, which I think went a long way to change the perception. So 10 years later, a donor shows up, sees the model. He lost his son in Auschwitz. He writes a check. It gets built. 10 years later, there's a competition to rebuild the Historic Museum. This follows Washington, because Washington, in many ways, had more information in it than Yad Vashem, being much later. And so there's a competition. This was not given to me as a commission. And I come with the idea of, I didn't want to build on top of the hill. That's Pastoral Hill. I come with the idea of cutting into the mountain, having the whole museum underground, and emerging on the opposite side of the mountain. And eventually we win it, and we build it.
So, I mean, it's an interesting shape. So in cross-section, it's a triangle that essentially
It's
slices.
like a prism that goes right through, but the galleries are on either sides of it, and I cut the floor with channels, so you're forced to walk through the narrative like in a zigzag.
Right. But there's also a shaft of light.
From top, and also you see the light at the end of the
So
tunnel.
you're moving towards the light. And there's also the change of grade.
You go down into the mountain and emerge upwards after.
I can't help but point out that this is a long structure that sort of sits on top of the mountain. You've done other things that sit on top of large structures too that come later. I'm sure that's unrelated, but I just noticed it as we speak now.
Oh, I never thought of that connection.
It's a very. Have any of you been to this space? It's a very moving place, and especially because of the way you orient the view that comes out. You come out onto the terrace, basically.
Overlooking the Jerusalem forest.
Yeah.
Renewal.
Yeah. Can I get you to? I lived in Berlin for some years, and and of course I would go to the Jewish Museum occasionally. Have you been there?
I've been there.
Do you have any thoughts about it?
Yeah, it preceded Yad Vashem, and I was critical of it. Actually, the main reason was not so much the detail of the architecture, but because Libeskind was asked to do a museum about celebrating the life of German Jewry and Berlin Jewry. And he made a Holocaust museum instead of celebrating the life of. And that was not his task, and I think it was a mistake. They did Eisenman designed the official Holocaust memorial in Berlin, and I think Libeskind should have celebrated a civilization that was extraordinary.
There was something, the reason I mention in this context is because, I don't know if any of you have been to the Berlin Museum to which I am referring. Probably some of you have, yeah. But it's constructed, I mean, the circulation is that you basically go downstairs through this cabinet of horrors, which is supposed to sort of reenact in some way that I find profoundly offensive, the experience of the Holocaust, through these sort of staged rooms. And then you go upstairs, and then you go through the history of Jewry. What's interesting here is that, you know, you're moving towards the light. There's always this sense that you have a context.
It was very controversial when I proposed the bursting out of the mountain into the light. There was a building committee which included survivors and a couple of historians. And they all said, why should the architect have the last word and be optimistic about it? And it was a long discussion, I mean, of weeks, not of days, until I succeeded in convincing them that, and I knew it because of Washington. When I went to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, and you go through the narrative, you end up in this octagonal room, and you're suspended. It's like, you know, what next? And I felt that we prevailed. Here we are. You're in Jerusalem, and we prevailed. And what's more symbolic than the Jerusalem forest?
Yeah, no, that's exactly what comes across, and is you know, an interesting message. They are contextual completely. I don't know how many people also realize that the original displays at Auschwitz were done by the survivors, and that those famous sort of containers of hair and glasses and prosthetics and so forth were really the attempts of survivors to convey something of the scale.
I didn't know that till today.
Yeah, the scale of the atrocity. How there are all these pavilions at Auschwitz, which are different countries talking.
Pavilions happen to be the shacks of.
Right. Well, that site had originally been a military complex,
Yeah.
And then was converted into the first. I won't go into the whole history of extermination, but in any case, the museum that was created by survivors, and at that point, the thing that seemed most crucial to convey was the scale of the atrocity. Everyone had seen death, but no one really could understand the extent of it. And so, actually, in a strange way now, it fails to convey that the scale that we think of as 6 million. And it also, I think we have become so remote in time from that stories of individuals often have a more potent.
That's what Yad Vashem did as an approach, that you have statistical stuff, but everything at the end is personal testimonies, and some of them are very powerful.
But the thing I was getting to, which is that here, as there at Auschwitz, there's still the survivors insisted that that the story not be told as one of their failure, and so which was kind of interesting. And I think here you also, you know, this idea of moving down and then up again is actually is subtle but moving. We don't have a lot of time, so we're moving to a really different project. Moshe, I have to say that
Different world.
a different world. I can't ask you to talk about half of your life in 2 minutes, but look, I'll pose a question for you, which I think you've probably heard before, which is that I think it's hard for some people to reconcile that the designer of Habitat also is the designer of Marina Bay Sands. So how do you get from one place, and what is the connection in your head?
I mean, the literal connection is that at the opening of Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum, it's outdoors, it's very cold. We all rush to the washroom, long line. I'm standing there, all of a sudden, a wheelchair comes next to me. Sheldon Adelson is sitting in it. So you did a pretty good job here. Thank you, Mr. Adlerson. I have this project in Singapore, and we've been at it for some months. The Singaporeans tells me they like our company, but they don't want Las Vegas architecture. Are you interested in coming and working on it? That's how it happened.
Yeah.
So 2 weeks later, I'm in Las Vegas. Michal, my wife, says, oh, a casino over my dead body. But actually, the casino part is 2% of it. I mean, it's a mixed-use urban complex. And I thought, here's an opportunity to create an exemplary public realm building. And he did not know, but I had a long history in Singapore. I had done a number of buildings there, and I was working with the URA, Urban Redevelopment Authority. And so for me, this was a scale changer, like a game changer. You could really do a piece of city and show at a very high density what you could do. And part of it was the idea that you can create parks and gardens on the 59th floor or on the 50th.
Well, that was not the original.
No, it evolved. I mean, it evolved as I designed. In fact, he said, what? Right. Take this XX thing off the building, you know.
Adelson did.
Adelson did, yeah. He
and,
was,
of course, wanted to claim that it was his idea.
yes.
How did it get up there, by the way? What was going on?
I mean, we were working. I convinced him to do 3 towers because they wanted one so that there'd be some big openings to the sea. It wouldn't be a big wall. And we had swimming pools and parks and gardens and all that, and we ran out of space. This is 6 million square feet. There was a big piece of balsa wood in the workshop, in the model shop, and at some point I said, hey, and put it on top of on top. And we had some of the clients' people with us. And, you know, actually once that moment was like, yeah, that makes sense, you know. And then there was a moment that's very important, that it was symmetrical, 3 towers symmetrical. And we had to work with Feng Shui masters. And I don't dismiss them anymore because they've always worked out for me, the Feng Shui master. So this Feng Shui master says, symmetrical, not good. Like symmetrical is like very powerful, it's a power thing. And then I started thinking asymmetry might, you know, so we took that piece of wood and we shoved it all the way sideways. So it's almost flush at one end, like the aft of a ship, and the other side cantilevers 200 feet out. And that's how the cantilever was born, which really makes it dynamic. I mean, I think when we won it, everybody was saying, this is the dynamic spirit of Singapore.
I mean, just to you know, if you could take me again back to the arc from Habitat. Obviously, it's an incredibly different project in a different era and different client and everything.
The principles are the same.
In what sense?
First, the complete integration of plant life and outdoor spaces with the indoor spaces at an urban scale rather than the domestic scale. And I think the interest in the public realm, very differently expressed here than in the original Habitat, is part of a journey of trying to understand, you know, what are the streets and the piazzas and the agoras are gone. What we have right now are malls. If you tell me mall is the future of the city, I don't want to have any part of it. Right. I mean,
me too.
So we got to reinvent the public realm, and much of it is built privately today. And how do you make private built space and private owned space really public? And in Singapore, I succeeded in part because the URA has the same objective. And they have guidelines, and they really were like the wind behind me, because the developer's attitude is make it self-contained, make it introvert, get people in and let them not find their way out. That's what the philosophy of mall designers are. And if you think of the Galleria Victoria Emanuel, it starts at the at the Scala Piazza, and it goes to the Duomo Piazza, and it connects pieces of the city. It's part of the public realm. I don't know if it's private or not, but it's part of the public realm. And that's been a powerful theme, but it's also part of Asia now. We're here in Asia. We built 6 million square feet. We did it in 4 years. We could do anything. So this is the same feeling like after Habitat. We can do anything now.
Yeah.
Except we are.
We've gotten to the I think it's over. The questions are over here. So let me just before we move to the questions, let me just get to the end. You have an exhibition. So you've done a book. You also just have an exhibition that's opened about unbuilt projects, and I didn't want to leave that unspoken because it's really interesting to look back at your work. And one of those, some of them are habitat-related projects.
These are recent projects following the research program that we did in the office about rethinking habitat.
Right. So there's, for instance, on the lower left, I think I'm looking at the lower left, a project in Quito, right?
Quito, above Qingguangdao in China. On my right, which is Sri Lanka, Colombo. So these are all over Asia, but also elsewhere, realizing the ideas of habitat today. And what's fascinating is that the next generation, my colleagues 50 years old, like some of the leading practices, they're into this.
Yeah. Do you feel like you teach? Do you feel like the climate is changing in the
very hot in the schools?
Why? What's the change? Yeah.
The fascination with fractalizing buildings, breaking them up, integrating plant life into, in fact, it's become almost the thing to do. You just put a lot of green on your renderings, sometimes for real, sometimes. But it's also more profound than that. And so there is that.
Prefab.
Prefab coming back as well. And all of it also sort of fueled by the interest in sustainability. Wood coming back as a building material for, even 10, 12-story buildings. We're doing modular housing, prefabricated in robotic factories using cross-laminated timber panels in modules that are shipped from the factory right now. So, you're really coming back to new possibilities and new materials.
Amazing. It's circular. Let's end with the video that you have, which is a...
So this is Epic Games, who came to us last year and said, we want to digitize your original habitat. We want to make it virtual reality, and we want to make it available to anybody who uses our games. And so what you're seeing is an early draft. They are completely digitizing it with plant life. You will be able to walk into the kitchens and the bathrooms and just be there. But that's an early digitizing. So here I could see for the first time something we designed 60 years ago. You have these membranes which lean one on the other, inclined elevators, and all the low levels are schools and shops and offices and public facilities. All of them face southeast and southwest, so they all get sunlight. And the roof of the whole thing is a public promenade. So soon to come in full color and goggles.
I saw at the Center for Architecture the other day a presentation by a young group of architects on sort of designing a virtual reality world and putting their models in and then designing a city around that. It was actually kind of amazing and really interesting. There's a whole other discussion.
As long as it doesn't replace real buildings.
No, I think there's a distance to go. So I have a bunch of questions. I'm going to edit them. I'm going to, and forgive me if I'm not asking your question, but I've been told we have about 3 or so. So one of them, do you believe there is an ideal level of density?
I do believe, of course, you have to qualify depending on the conditions. But let's talk about the conditions of today of urbanization in the mega cities and the enormous the economy driving to enormous concentration. I think there is, and I think it is lower than what it is in our megacities. For example, Lower Manhattan is zoned at 12 FAR, 12 times the land coverage. And that's assuming everybody realizes their full thing. I think there's no reason to go that high, and that if we did a little less spreading, as we do, and a little less concentration, it would be cheaper, consume less resources to achieve a quality of life. And I think that's more like 8. I think a floor ratio of 8 is much more reasonable than 12 or the 20 or 25 of Hong Kong or cities like that.
Well, Midtown now you have some 30 or 32 even, I think. But
Midtown is not yet 30 on
well,
average.
I don't know what not one World Trade.
Oh, if you take individual buildings, they can be way over that.
No, I meant around Vanderbilt Avenue or something. Isn't that rezoning of East Midtown? But I don't want to get my FIA.
Anyhow, I mean, I think it's lower than the downtowns of the big cities today. I think most of the density that we're seeing is developer-driven and just trying to milk a few more dollars out of a piece of land. And most of the world today, except with very few exceptions, planning is totally driven by developers. Planning is completely discredited as an idea.
Yeah, I mean, New York City doesn't actually plan it.
The United States doesn't plan,
Yeah.
period.
Yeah, by the way, this is not a question here, but in the book you also mentioned something that was also very foresighted. You talked at a certain point about like eliminating the car ownership, private car ownership, which is also speaks to the way in which obviously you try to think in an integrated way about architecture and urbanism. Just briefly, that was in the 70s, I think, or something, wasn't it?
It's about 20 years ago, I wrote a book, The City After the Automobile. And the premise is not that we give up the automobile as a form of mobility, because I don't think we're so inclined, but that if we replaced it by on-demand vehicles, which we could pick up anywhere, like the bicycles, and drop anywhere, it would cut the number of cars in the city by 2/3. It would almost eliminate parking garages because everything would be in action. And of course, you could electrify the whole system. So this was a step towards eliminating cars without eliminating them. And I didn't think of self-driving cars at the time, which would be another dimension, although that seems to be in spite of all the promises about 30, 40 years away.
Yeah, but it is a kind of conversation that's also come.
Yeah, and that's a game changer.
Yeah.
Again.
Either driverless cars will be the answer to that, or there'll be a new form of Carmageddon, but it's another conversation. Can you talk about the emotional experience of having so many projects canceled after the Expo Habitat 67?
It varies. It varies. I mean, on the whole, it's tough. It's part of our professional life. But when you do a competition, you know there's an element of risk. You might spend 3-4 months on it, 5 months, whatever. So you get attached. Sometimes you think you did something good. And then when you lose it, you sort of half prepared, because competitions are playing roulette in a way, particularly open competitions, which we don't do anymore, but where there were 700 entries. So, but even when you're doing one of like 5 or 6 participants, the most painful is when you have a commission, you work on it for years. And in my case, I have 2 examples. For New Yorkers, Columbus Center. We won the competition with Mort Zuckerman.
Columbus Circle, yeah.
Columbus Circle, which is now the
Boston Properties.
It's now the
Related
building. We win the competition. We work on it. Solomon Brothers are the main tenant. I spent 3 years. I opened a New York office. I have 40 people working away on it. The New York Times You were not yet the architecture critic. Paul Goldberger, cut and dice architecture. You know, the shadow, with the black umbrellas. Anybody remembers the black umbrellas, or it's already forgotten? Thank goodness. And then the market collapses. Solomon withdraws. The project dies. I lay off 40 people in one day. These are really painful. Yeah. Another example: Ballet Opera House, Toronto. Begin construction. Elections, the NDP, the Socialist Party, get in Ontario, and they say opera's for the wealthy. Cut. Like,
Yeah, you do mention in the and Pompidou.
Pompidou. Well, Pompidou was a competition I did with students.
Right.
We didn't win it. You know, it's a project that you look back and you say, wow, you know, it was very fresh. But that's not the same pain threshold.
Right. Especially having to let people go. You mentioned in the book also the nature of doing competitions and the money that architects have to spend, and often, you know, you go into in an interesting way the kind of precarious finances of architecture.
The whole finance of the architecture world is ridiculous, but the competitions, particularly because most competitions, they are done by developers, and they invite 4 or 5 leading firms. They're not like giving opportunities to the young firms, and if it costs to do a competition $500,000, they probably offer $50,000 per stipend. And we all suckers jump right into it, and we should learn from the lawyers and whoever.
Well, that's a whole other discussion about the way you get paid and why, but
Yeah.
for another occasion. Why did your family have to leave Haifa from Montreal?
My father was, as I mentioned, a merchant, a textile merchant. He was a very avid believer in free enterprise. And when the government of Israel was formed, the first decade was very socialistic, state-controlled economy, mostly done through the trade unions. And they ceased giving him import license. They basically froze his business or starved his business. He tried a couple of other businesses. They always wanted controlling. And he says, I can't stand living with the Bolsheviks. And he picked up and went. Of course, I was a socialist, so I was insulted twice. Right. Once for the Bolsheviks and once for being exiled.
I think that's 3 questions and 2 more? Okay, absolutely. Is there a project type you haven't worked on but would like to? And thank you for coming tonight.
I love doing projects I've never done, and we always in the office try and get a new type, like our first airport, first library. We haven't done a stadium. That's the only building type I think we haven't done. So I'd like to do a stadium, actually.
A stadium.
I don't know about Brooklyn.
Yes.
But I'd like to do a stadium.
Why? What is it about that typology?
It's just it's a typology that needs to deal with the ritual of sport and the numbers, but also structural invention. So it's both, and that's fascinating.
It has been a form that has produced some kind of amazing things.
Yeah.
It's true. Okay, last question. How did you develop the concept of the power of place?
I think it started in Jerusalem. I think when I came to Jerusalem, I remember my first building was the yeshiva, Porat Yosef in the Old City. And there was, they had 2 designs or 3 designs done before I was commissioned. One was a very traditional building, and one was an old glass box done by a New York architect, and both got chucked out. So then the rabbis kind of threateningly asked me in the interview, are you going to do a modern building for us or a traditional building? So I guess, given the rabbis, I go Talmudic and I say, if I succeed, you won't be able to answer the question. But that became a motto, because can you make a building that's contemporary, authentic, and belongs to the city, feels like it's part of that heritage. And out of that came the conviction later on in Ottawa and in India and in just anywhere, actually, that the site and the culture and the setting and the climate must inform the design to the point where it overpowers your own personal linguistic, let's call it. So I've never had a very distinct, there were a series of principles that prevail, but not like, say, someone like Richard Meyer, where you can recognize a building at once, regardless of where it is, because of the consistency of the language.
Right. Moshe, we could go on, but we can't go on. So thank you so much, and congratulations about the book.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming.
Thank you all for joining us. We will have a book signing in the lobby immediately after this event.